Section 5. The so-called labor fund. It has been shown in the course of this inquiry that capital is not a fixed magnitude, but is a part of social wealth, elastic and constantly fluctuating with the division of fresh surplus value into revenue and additional capital. It has been seen further that even with a given magnitude of functioning capital, the labor power, the science, and the land, by which are to be understood economically all conditions of labor furnished by nature independently of humans, embodied in it, form elastic powers of capital, allowing it, within certain limits, a field of action independent of its own magnitude. In this inquiry, we have neglected all effects of the process of circulation, effects which may produce very different degrees of efficiency in the same mass of capital. And as we presupposed the limits set by capitalist production, that is to say, presupposed the process of social production in a form developed by purely spontaneous growth, we neglected any more rational combination, directly and systematically practicable with the means of production and the mass of labor power at present disposable. Classical economy always loved to conceive social capital as a fixed magnitude of a fixed degree of efficiency, but this prejudice was first established as a dogma by the arch-Philistine Jeremy Bentham, that insipid, pedantic, leather-tongued oracle of the ordinary bourgeois intelligence of the 19th century. Footnote, compare among others Jeremy Bentham's Theory of Punishment and Reward, 3rd edition, Paris, 1826. Back to the main text. Bentham is among philosophers what Martin Tupper is among poets. Both could only have been manufactured in England. Footnote, Bentham is a purely English phenomenon. Not even excepting our philosopher Christian Wolff, in no time and in no country has the most homespun commonplace ever strutted about in so self-satisfied a way. The principle of utility was no discovery of Bentham. He simply reproduced in his dull way what Helvetius and other Frenchmen had said with spirit in the 18th century. To know what is useful for a dog, one must study dog nature. This nature itself is not to be deduced from the principle of utility. Applying this to humans, those who would criticize all human acts, movements, relations, etc. by the principle of utility must first deal with human nature in general, and then with human nature as modified in each historical epoch. Bentham makes short work of it. With the driest naivete, he takes the modern shopkeeper, especially the English shopkeeper, as the normal man. Whatever is useful to this queer normal man and to his world is absolutely useful. This yard measure, then, he applies to past, present, and future. The Christian religion, for example, is, quote, useful, quote, because it forbids in the name of religion the same faults that the penal code condemns in the name of the law, unquote. Artistic criticism is, quote, harmful because it disturbs worthy people in their enjoyment of Martin Tupper, etc. With such rubbish has the brave fellow, with his motto, no day without a line, piled up mountains of books. Had I the courage of my friend Heinrich Heine, I should call Mr. Jeremy a genius in the way of bourgeois stupidity. Back to the main text. In the light of his dogma, the commonest phenomena of the process of production, as for example its sudden expansions and contractions, nay, even accumulation itself, become perfectly inconceivable. Footnote quoting S. Bailey, Money and Its Vicissitudes, political economists are too apt to consider a certain quantity of capital and a certain number of laborers as productive instruments of uniform power, or operating with a certain uniform intensity. Those who maintain that commodities are the sole agents of production prove that production could never be enlarged, for it requires as an indispensable condition to such an enlargement that food, raw materials, and tools should be previously augmented, which is in fact maintaining that no increase of production can take place without a previous increase, or in other words, that an increase is impossible, unquote. Bailey criticizes the dogma mainly from the point of view of the process of circulation. Back to the main text. The dogma was used by Bentham himself, as well as by Malthus, James Mill, McCulloch, etc., for an apologetic purpose, and especially in order to represent one part of capital, namely variable capital, or that part convertible into labor power as a fixed magnitude. The material of variable capital, i.e. the mass of the means of subsistence that it represents for the laborer, or the so-called labor fund, was fabled as a separate part of social wealth, fixed by natural laws and unchangeable. To set in motion the part of social wealth which is to function as constant capital, or, to express it in a material form as means of production, a definite mass of living labor is required. This mass is given technologically, but neither is the number of laborers required to render fluid this mass of labor power given. It changes with the degree of exploitation of the individual labor power, nor is the price of this labor power given, but only its minimum limit, which is moreover very variable. The facts that lie at the bottom of this dogma are these. On the one hand, the laborer has no right to interfere in the division of social wealth into means of enjoyment for the non-laborer and means of production. Footnote, John Stuart Mill, in his Principles of Political Economy, says, quote, "The really exhausting and the really repulsive labors, instead of being better paid than others, are almost invariably paid the worst of all. The more revolting the occupation, the more certain it is to receive the minimum of remuneration. The hardship and the earnings, instead of being directly proportional, as in any just arrangements of society they would be, are generally in an inverse ratio to one another." Unquote. To avoid misunderstanding, let me say that although men like John Stuart Mill are to blame for the contradiction between their traditional economic dogmas and their modern tendencies, it would be very wrong to class them with the herd of vulgar economic apologists. Back to the main text. On the other hand, only in favorable and exceptional cases has he the power to enlarge the so-called labor fund at the expense of the, quote, revenue of the wealthy. That is, of course, referring to the laborer. What silly tautology results from the attempt to represent the capitalistic limits of the labor fund as its natural and social limits may be seen, for example, in Professor Fawcett, meaning H. Fawcett, Professor of Political Economy at Cambridge, author of The Economic Position of the British Laborer, 1865. Quote, "The circulating capital of a country," he says, "is its wage fund. Hence, if we desire to calculate the average money wages received by each laborer, we have simply to divide the amount of this capital by the number of the laboring population." Unquote. Footnote, I must here remind the reader that the categories variable and constant capital were first used by me. Political economy since the time of Adam Smith has confusedly mixed up the essential distinctions involved in these categories with the mere formal differences arising out of the process of circulation of fixed and circulating capital. For further details on this point, see Book 2, Part 2. Back to the main text. That is to say, we first add together the individual wages actually paid, and then we affirm that the sum thus obtained forms the total value of the, quote, labor fund, determined and vouchsafed to us by God and nature. Lastly, we divide the sum thus obtained by the number of laborers to find out again how much may come to each on the average. An uncommonly knowing dodge, this. It did not prevent Mr. Fawcett saying in the same breath, quote, "The aggregate wealth which is annually saved in England is divided into two portions. One portion is employed as capital to maintain our industry, and the other portion is exported to foreign countries. Only a portion, and perhaps not a large portion of the wealth which is annually saved in this country is invested in our own industry." Unquote. The greater part of the yearly accruing surplus product, embezzled because abstracted without return of an equivalent from the English laborer, is thus used as capital, not in England, but in foreign countries. But with the additional capital thus exported, a part of the labor fund, invented by God and Bentham, is also exported. Footnote, it might be said that not only capital, but also laborers, in the shape of emigrants, are annually exported from England. In the text, however, there is no question of the peculium of the emigrants, who are in great part not laborers. The sons of farmers make up a great part of them. The additional capital annually transported abroad to be put out at interest is in much greater proportion to the annual accumulation than the yearly emigration is to the yearly increase of population. And that is the end of Chapter 24. One more chapter to go in Part 7 of 8, and again, it is the second longest chapter in the book, Chapter 25 coming up. But I really hope that those of you who have made it this far will continue with me through to the end of the book. There's really not that much left to go. A lot of the chapters in Part 8 are quite short. And, if you want to listen to the whole book again, that might not be a bad idea, as a lot of the people have been reporting that they're struggling with the earlier chapters, but I think that after hearing them in context, for example, Chapter 1 is pretty abstract, but by now we know what a use value is, we know what constant capital is, we know what variable capital is, we know what the transfer of value is, and so on. So I think going back, you'll see it's not so big and scary. Even the first time through, if you have done the basic Marxism-Leninism study guide prior to this and worked your way up to it, or especially on the second time around. But what do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. You can either make a one-time or a recurring donation, and every contribution is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without that support. So if you like this channel, Thank me, but also thank a patron or buy me a coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself, as we don't run ads or sponsorships, so that support is really important. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm, which I'm hearing these days prefers 8 to 10 word comments to register them, but I don't know. Do what you can. And lastly, remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned on this channel and apply it to your real-world political organizing. Thanks again, and we will see you in the next video.